In the quiet town of Willow Creek, where everyone knew each other's names and routines, strangers were rare visitors. Life moved slowly there. Children ran barefoot on the dusty roads, old men played chess under the oak tree in the park, and neighbors waved from porches that hadn't changed in decades. But one cloudy afternoon, a stranger stepped off the bus, his coat dusty, his eyes tired, and a small leather notebook clutched in his hands. His name was Thomas Reid, though few cared to ask. He walked with a limp that told of years hard-lived, and his clothes, though neat, looked worn from travel. He arrived without fanfare, just another man in a place that didn't expect anyone new. Yet, there was something about him, a quiet gentleness, a patience in the way he moved, and an unspoken sorrow that seemed to hover around him like fog. He took a room at the small inn by the corner of Maple Street, run by Mrs. Langley, a widow who had spent most of her life serving travelers who stayed a night or two before vanishing down the road again. Thomas, however, stayed longer than most. He didn't say why. He would rise early, sit by the window in the inn's dining room, drink his coffee black, and write for hours in that small leather notebook. Sometimes he would smile faintly, as if remembering something far away. Other times, he would stare out the window for long minutes, lost in thoughts that had no end. Word of the quiet stranger spread through Willow Creek, as news always did in small towns. Some thought he was an artist seeking peace, others guessed he was a man hiding from his past. But no one knew for sure. It was the local mechanic, Jake Thompson, who first spoke to him, after finding Thomas sitting near the riverbank, watching the current with that same faraway look. "Pretty spot, isn't it?" Jake said, tossing a stone into the water. Thomas looked up and smiled. "Yes. Peaceful. Like it's been waiting all these years just to be noticed." Jake chuckled. "You sound like my grandmother. She used to say the river remembers everyone who's ever stopped to watch it." Thomas's smile faded, replaced by something softer, almost wistful. "Maybe it does," he murmured. "Maybe it remembers those who've forgotten themselves." It wasn't long before Thomas became a quiet presence in the town. He helped carry groceries for Mrs. Palmer, the elderly baker whose arthritis made lifting heavy bags difficult. He fixed the squeaky door at the church without being asked. He read stories to children in the park when their mothers were busy at the market. He never asked for anything in return. He would simply smile, nod politely, and move on with his day. But what people noticed most was how he remembered things. The names of people he'd just met, the birthday of the grocer's youngest daughter, the color of flowers that grew outside the schoolhouse, the tune old Mr. Harris hummed while sweeping his porch. Even the smallest details seemed to stay with him, as though every kindness, every face, every smile was a page written into his heart. One day, he stopped by the local diner, a cozy place called Rosie's, where the smell of coffee and pancakes never faded. The waitress, a young woman named Emily, had been working there for years, saving money to move to the city. She had kind eyes but carried the kind of weariness that comes from waiting too long for something better. "You're the new fellow at the inn," she said, pouring him coffee. "Yes," Thomas said. "And you're Emily. You hum when you're nervous." She blinked in surprise. "How'd you know that?" "You were humming yesterday when Mrs. Langley came by. She told you her niece got married, and you smiled, but you didn't really seem happy. You hummed right after." Emily laughed, a little embarrassed. "You notice a lot, don't you?" Thomas stirred his coffee. "Sometimes noticing is all we can do to remember what matters." Emily didn't understand then what he meant, but she would, in time. Weeks passed, and the townspeople grew fond of the quiet stranger. He attended local gatherings, helped repair the playground fence, and once even played the old piano in the community hall, his fingers trembling slightly but producing a melody so gentle that it brought tears to a few eyes. He seemed to belong everywhere and nowhere all at once. Yet, despite his kindness, there was something unspoken about Thomas, a weight he carried that no one could name. He would sometimes stop mid-sentence, his gaze drifting to some invisible place, his hand tightening on that small leather notebook he always carried. One cold evening, as the first snow began to fall, Mrs. Langley found Thomas sitting by the fireplace in the inn's lounge, staring at an old photograph. She approached quietly. "Cold night," she said, placing a blanket over his shoulders. "Thank you," he murmured. She glanced at the photo. It showed a young woman with bright eyes, standing beside a little boy who looked no older than 6. "Your family?" she asked gently. He hesitated, his voice soft as a whisper. "Once." Mrs. Langley didn't ask more. She'd lived long enough to know that some stories were carried like scars, best left untouched unless offered freely. The next morning, Thomas visited the local school. He watched the children play during recess, laughing and chasing each other through the snow. One little boy, wearing a worn red jacket, sat alone on a bench, tracing shapes into the frost with his finger. Thomas approached him slowly. "Mind if I sit?" The boy shrugged. "No one else wants to." Thomas sat down beside him. "That's their loss." The boy smiled faintly. "My mom says that too." "Smart woman," Thomas said. The boy's name was Ethan. He was 8 years old, quiet and thoughtful, much like Thomas himself. His father had left years ago, and his mother worked double shifts at the diner to keep food on the table. Thomas began meeting him there every day after school, helping him with homework, listening to his stories about wanting to become a pilot. Over time, a bond formed between them, unspoken yet deep. To Ethan, Thomas was the first adult who truly listened. To Thomas, Ethan was a reminder of something precious he'd once lost and could never reclaim. Winter turned to spring, and Willow Creek blossomed again. One afternoon, the townspeople gathered for the annual festival, a day of laughter, food, and music. Thomas joined too, helping decorate the square with ribbons and lanterns. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, the children performed a small play on the makeshift stage, Ethan among them. When his turn came, the boy looked nervous, scanning the crowd until his eyes found Thomas, who smiled and gave him a reassuring nod. Ethan delivered his lines perfectly. The crowd cheered, and for a brief moment, Thomas felt something he hadn't felt in years: peace. Later that night, after the festival ended, Thomas walked to the riverbank once more. He opened his leather notebook, turning to a page filled with faded handwriting. At the top were the words, "Things I must remember." Below were dozens of names, places, dates, and small notes, moments of kindness, faces of strangers, fragments of a life he had tried not to forget. And at the bottom, a single line stood out, "For Anna and James, so they will know I never forgot." A tear slipped down his cheek as he whispered, "I remember." The next morning, he was gone. His room was neat, his belongings packed, the only thing left behind was the leather notebook placed on the nightstand with a note addressed to Mrs. Langley. It read simply, "Thank you for giving a stranger a home. I came here to remember who I was. I'm leaving because I finally do." Inside the notebook, Mrs. Langley found not only his memories but letters written to various people in town, small notes of gratitude, each one handwritten with care. There was one for Emily, thanking her for reminding him that kindness doesn't always need grand gestures. One for Jake, for sharing laughter by the river. And one for Ethan, the boy who'd given him the courage to forgive himself. Ethan's letter read, "Dear Ethan, you once told me you wanted to fly so you could see the whole world. I hope you do. But remember, the world isn't just what's out there, it's the people who make you feel seen. I once had a son about your age. His name was James. I made mistakes that took me away from him, and for years, I thought I'd lost the right to remember him. But then I met you, and you showed me that love doesn't end just because time passes. It waits, quietly, until we're ready to hold it again. Keep being kind. The world needs boys like you. Thomas." When Mrs. Langley read the letter to Ethan's mother, she wept. Days turned into weeks, and though Thomas never returned, his presence lingered in Willow Creek. People began to live a little differently after that. Emily started humming openly as she worked, no longer embarrassed. Jake began fixing things around town for free, saying, "Someone's got to keep Thomas's kindness alive." Mrs. Palmer started baking extra bread each morning for anyone who couldn't afford it. And Ethan, he kept the letter framed on his bedside table. Years later, he did become a pilot, just as he dreamed. Every time he flew over rivers and towns, he would think of the stranger who remembered, and how his quiet kindness had changed a small town forever. Decades later, when Ethan returned to Willow Creek with children of his own, the old inn still stood, though Mrs. Langley had long passed. On its wall hung a faded photograph, a group picture taken the night of the festival. In the back, barely visible, was Thomas, smiling faintly, a shadow among friends. Ethan showed the photo to his daughter and said, "That man was a stranger once. But he taught us all what it means to remember." And in the hush of the room, as sunlight streamed through the dusty window, Ethan realized that though years had passed, the memory of kindness never truly faded. Some people leave footprints not in the sand, but in hearts, and those marks, once made, never wash away. Thomas Reid had come to Willow Creek a stranger. But he left as something far greater, a reminder that even the smallest act of kindness, when remembered, can live forever.